In my last video, I talked about becoming aware of ourselves. We looked at different forms of awareness, how different catalysts can trigger it, how we can sharpen it, and how we can use it to uncover our true self with a capital S. But what I didn't warn you about is that awareness doesn't automatically lead to the truth. Sometimes it just leads to a more convincing lie. Observation slowly turns into interpretation. Interpretation becomes identity. Identity becomes a story. And sometimes that story becomes a lifelong performance. Awareness is only the starting point. It's the opening of our eyes, and what comes in then is in fact rarely left unjudged. Because as the conscious beings that we are on a constant quest in life to find meaning. Viktor Frankl argued that people can endure almost anything if they can frame it within a meaningful narrative. And Friedrich Nietzsche suggested humans would rather will meaning into existence than face a meaningless world. And that's because, from an evolutionary standpoint, finding meaning in the patterns of our surroundings kept us alive. Our brain does not necessarily tell us the truth. It predicts, connects, and fills in gaps. I talked about saccadic suppression in my last video, which is connected to that. And it does so because it wants safety. Predictability is safe. Coherence is safe. Certainty is safe. It feels safer to accept a convincing story than to tolerate uncertainty. But in this quest for meaning, we can actually contaminate our sense of self. And that's not because we lie about facts. I am angry is a fact. But we instead lie about the meaning of that observation. I am angry suddenly becomes I am an angry person. But a temporary observation often doesn't really mean anything. It just shows that we have a can of worms to open. Thus, seeing yourself in the mirror is one thing. But understanding and maybe even questioning what you're looking at is another. And sadly, we often don't get the time and space from our brain to do so in a sober and controlled state. Every sensation, every event, every feeling needs to be filtered and labeled quickly for our survival. And when we do that, we first and foremost do so through interpretation. From our brain's perspective, raw experience is meaningless until we interpret it. But our interpretation often trades accuracy for something that feels more familiar. And that's where our self-awareness now fails us, and where instead self-perception begins. It's the shift from seeing to believing, from observation to identity. And we interpret what we see through bias and ego and desire and habit and even fickle emotional filters that can change in the blink of an eye. Now, the actual problem is though that interpretation is not optional. Because again, our brain is a prediction engine. And because this evolutionary need is attached to such volatile factors, interpretation and further meaning making are unstable and sometimes straight out incorrect. Like spending an hour dissecting the message of an exposition piece until someone points out that this is just a bucket of dirty mop water left behind by the cleaning lady. Because of this heavily influenced interpretation, you can be self-aware but still have a distorted self-perception. While self-awareness might observe that I'm fearing failure, self-perception might wrongfully interpret that as I am a coward. One is merely observational, fluid, and temporary, while the other one is self-defining and permanent, and most likely not true. And since humans have stumbled over the same psychological hurdles since our inception, this realization is old news. Sartre argued that we are constantly creating ourselves through our choices. See existentialism. Sartre also mentioned the gaze, the idea that we come to know ourselves through the eyes of others, that we become who we are by being seen. Nietzsche implied that there are only interpretations, see perspectivism. And now psychologist Dan McAdams showed that we might even fall into the trap of turning those interpretations into a full-on life story, or a so-called narrative identity. When falling victim to our inner narrator, our sense of self might become a story written from fragments of experience, social roles, trauma, and feedback we get from others. We now have given our interpretation a structure, put them into context, and formed a fiction that feels like fact. We now are the artist, the intellectual, the misunderstood, or the good one. Those identities are fixed labels that can trap us, rather than keeping us open to what we could become. Freud talked about this in the term of ego attachment, a clinging to certain self-concepts for safety, even if they no longer serve us. We are becoming emotionally invested in a particular self-image, and once the narrative sets, the mind edits reality to match it, confirming who we believe we are instead of who we might actually be. And yes, you guessed right, that's called confirmation confirmation bias. Everything that doesn't support our story now gets disregarded. If you see yourself as a failure, you filter out every success. Or if you see yourself as the good one, you will rationalize harm. We do so to protect our ego, because when our beliefs are challenged, it causes discomfort, a cognitive dissonance, so we unconsciously distort reality to keep our worldview intact. Now, when our perception of us and our narrative identity solidify, we might then in the final stage end up with a conscious and outward performance. Performance is acted out narration. It's the moment when the lie we tell ourselves becomes a role that we play. It's something we consciously choose to embody. For example, a character we step into, or a new version of ourselves that we experiment with, or even a quality we practice before it fully feels natural. Think fake it till you make it. The identity we wear now becomes a mask mistaken for a face. We do see the mask in the mirror, but we forget that this mask doesn't actually define us, that there is a real us underneath it. Carl Jung named this mask the persona, a role we adopt to function in society. It's not inherently bad, but dangerous if we mistake it for our true self, because now the story starts to actively replace the self. And the turning point comes when we feel that we must protect this persona, because stepping out of character feels threatening. Or when the performance begins dictating what we think we are allowed to feel or do or even become later on. This can develop into a never-ending tragic stage play, in which someone who sees themselves as a failure never realizes how resilient and talented they are. Or in which someone who thinks of themselves as unlovable cannot see the genuine appreciation paid to them by others. Narcissism also falls into that as an upside-down example, where someone who is manipulative performs the role of a benevolent Samaritan, not realizing that they are actually harming people. A while ago, I stumbled upon an article from writer Justin Brown, where he talks about the difference between commitment versus attachment and how a generation of people have confused temporary alignments with permanent essence, mistaking belief systems for identity itself. That's unhinged performance to the point of being destructive. You find a link to the article in the description. He continues to say that fluid integrity becomes the antidote here, meaning to stay true not to a static identity, but to the evolving truth of who you are. And we all are ever evolving, which is a good thing. Now, as you can see, there are layers to this. We start with self-awareness that might become a flawed self-perception that becomes an inner narrative that turns into a performance. The deeper we go, the harder it is to get back to the origin. So even if we finally found some insight through self-awareness, it doesn't guarantee a transformation. Awareness does not heal on its own, since just seeing something doesn't mean that we can or even want to address it. And if we are of the intelligent sort, it can even become a form of intellectual or spiritual bypass, where even wisdom becomes performance, and inside yet another mask worn to cover up the fact that we never actually met ourselves. It's easier than you might think to take the path of clumsy interpretations and strand at the barren shore of self-deception, instead of landing on the fertile ground of self-awareness. So how then can we battle self-deception? Awareness must always be accompanied by brutal honesty, to shine light onto our self-perception and the distortions we once called truth. We must step out of Plato's cave, confront the Jungian shadow, and commit to the lifelong process of individuation. According to Carl Jung, transformation doesn't necessarily come from rejecting the parts we dislike, but also just from understanding and even reuniting with them. He said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. By imagining figures of light, he meant the development of toxic positivity, a sort of avoidance that doesn't acknowledge and accept our flaws, and thus stifles true growth. We instead have to integrate and individuate, not to justify the past, but to stop being bound by it. I have talked about helpful tools in your quest of self-awareness and individuation in my last video, so I would refer you back to that if you want to tackle self-deception. The reassuring thing is, though, that most of the bad traits you think you have are actually just neutral. They become destructive if ignored, left unchecked, or even actively repressed. Being angry might just be a sign of repressed trauma that needs to be healed. Being strange might just hide some unique character traits that will give you a huge advantage in life. And being overly passionate might birth a creative fire that will write the next #1 summer hit. But okay, what if after you found your true self, you actually don't like what you see? see? Well, first of all, congratulations, you're not a narcissist. And then, of course, I'm not saying that you should justify anger that spills out and attacks others. Unhinging your frustration carelessly is not the kind of integrating of your anger that Jung would approve of. But these things need to be looked at from all angles and worked with, instead of just demonized and hidden. Most people close their eyes in front of their shadow and thus do indeed just stay angry. We do need to hold ourselves accountable for our flaws and not just try to cover them up. No matter what that confrontation looks like in the end or what it finally leads to, be it integration or reprogramming. Remember, you are not responsible for every trait you carry, but you are in fact responsible for what you do with what you discover. And if you discover something that doesn't serve you anymore or is even harmful to others, then awareness can give you authorship about your old stories. And yes, some people might turn away from you when you start exploring and integrating your shadow and become a more authentic you. But abandonment by a few others is much better than abandonment by yourself. And besides, do you really want to be surrounded by people that don't accept you for who you really are? For every person you lose in the process, you will for sure win someone that is more true to you. Confrontation hurts. Growth hurts. Just think about growing pains in children. But without those ruptures, we won't grow up. We won't become who we have the potential to be. Yes, it is more comfortable to stay where you are and don't face the threat of those pains. But if you are watching this video, chances are that you already know that you can't stay there. You have to go to the gym to get those muscle tears to build your strength. There is no other way. And don't forget that yourself is never fixed. You are not obligated to stay who you are. You are a never-ending story that should be just as colorful as a childhood classic. I'm usually not someone to say that you have to do anything, but I truly believe that if you want to be a well-rounded, empathic, self-aware, and most importantly happy and fulfilled individual, you have to confront. You have to be open to change. In order to see where your limits truly are, you have to get out there and twist your ankles, scuff your kneecaps, scrape your elbows, and most importantly, and before anything else, you have to stay curious. Thanks for watching. I don't know why I'm always getting so emotional when I say my final slogan. I think it's because I really truly believe that curiosity is the most important thing in life, because it's curiosity that makes us be empathic towards other people, that makes us grow because we venture out, we want to know things, we ask questions, so we learn. So I always truly mean it when I say to stay curious. Merely. Merely? I go with merely, but it's mere. So it must be merely. Merely observational. Merely sounds better. I could look it up, but I am emotionally invested in very particular words. Oh, that was a bit too aggressive. Where someone who is benevolent, no, exactly not. Development for our flaws. Confrontation, we practice, never-ending tragic into a never-ending oh man, still have a might wrongfully oh man, have a distorted self. I'm getting there.